Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you all. Before I start today, let me remind you, because Christine just got yesterday the proposed schedule for April and May. And there are some options, maybe even of if there are topics you're interested in, I am perfectly willing to kind of change some things out. On schedule for next week, though, we're going to take a look at post-World War II and the United States becoming sort of the international leader, that struggle between the superpowers. So we're going to sort of look at the United States stepping into international prominence, and we're going to, in particular, talk a little bit next week about the Marshall Plan, NATO, the Warsaw Pact as a response to that, sort of setting up, the divided world and the two superpowers, just so that if you have something that you have read or that you really enjoy about that, drag it back out and we can talk about that next week as we talk about some names that, we haven't talked about in a while, folks like Stalin and Khrushchev and back to Truman and Eisenhower and others as we look at that U.S. on the international stage. So today we're going to talk about what we would have talked about last Monday had I been here, and that's the countdown to the American Civil War. And whenever I think about the American Civil War, I'm reminded of a book that I read as a young adult that I actually used when I used to teach, called Across 5 Aprils. And a lot of you have probably read that book. It's designed for young readers, but it's a story that sort of traces one family, one soldier's experience, one family's reaction to the American Civil War. And I tell groups so often, we talk about the Civil War so often because it has left such a mark on our society, politically, culturally, socially. We talk about the Great War, we talk about the Texas War for Independence, which we'll talk about later in the month. But I think the Civil War we talk about so often because when we look at the Great War or we look at World War II, Korea, it's we, the United States, are united by a common adversary. And if we ever were at a moment of heightened unity, World War II is a prime example of that. We look at the American Civil War and it's just tragic because you have families divided, you have regions divided, you have armed conflict, but you have guerrilla conflict. It is just, civil wars are always the worst kinds of wars. That sounds like such a strange, because all war is horrible, but I think civil war, because it's fought in your backyard and it's fought on the churchyard grounds. You think about the Battle of Shiloh, which literally is on the grounds of the church at Shiloh. There's no getting away from a civil war. When it's a distant war, you have moments where maybe you can delude yourself into not thinking about it. So I always talk to people and I'll speak to adult groups sometimes and I'll say, well, talk to me about the American Civil War. What caused the American Civil War? And there are two answers. One is slavery, and we're going to talk about that today. The other is, well, it was the election of Abraham Lincoln. And the election of Abraham Lincoln, the war erupted, and it was because of his opposition to slavery. Well, some of that's true and some of that's not true. One is Lincoln's position on slavery has always been really difficult to discern, because he probably, as much as any president in the history of our nation, had a pretty good understanding of the limitations of his powers. Now, he will bluff his way through some things that worked out pretty well for him with the Emancipation Proclamation and others, but there was a lot more at play other than just American citizens who were unhappy with the election in 1860. It really, really goes back so much farther than that. So I'm going to kind of march us through a timeline. And, when we say, well, the issue was slavery, the issue wasn't slavery. Yes, the issue was slavery. Now, what you will have is some people will say, well, the issue was states' rights, the right of individual states to choose whether or not their states would be slave states. So the issue was states' rights. That's true too. But at the core of a lot of it was the rights of the states to do what? And slavery was always going to be a major part of that issue, and that's going to be the geographic diversity that we have in this nation. Even by the 1860s, this nation is so diverse when you think about New England all the way down to the deep South, that what was needed from an economy standpoint, slavery is just going to be an overlying issue in pretty much everything the South's going to look at. So let's go back and talk, and I say this every time that we get together, but let's go back to the beginning. It's always nice, it's kind of like when you have the preacher says, well, before we start, we've got to go back to Genesis. Well, we're going to go back to Genesis. So, our first permanent settlement is 1607. Jamestown. Roanoke is a little bit earlier, but they all disappear, and so they're not a permanent settlement, but Jamestown is. And that's 1607. Well, 12 years later, the first slaves arrived in Virginia, and it was a Dutch ship from the Netherlands carrying 20 blacks to Jamestown, and they were sold to the families that were there at Jamestown. By 1652, and many of you listening to me today have ancestors who were here by that early date, especially if you have ancestors in the New England area, mid-Atlantic states. They were certainly here by that day. By 1652, the New Netherlands signed into legislation an agreement with the Dutch Republic that they could import slaves. So, I think so often when I talk to groups, they think slaves were only in the South. That's not how it began, but we'll see kind of how it evolves to that point. So, 1652, the first state to actually authorize the importation will be the New Netherlands, which is, of course, today what we know as New York. So I think most people are kind of surprised when they hear that. Maryland, interestingly, in the 1650s, and Maryland is one of those Mason-Dixon line states, it's right there on the border. Maryland creates a piece of legislation, interestingly, in the 1650s that says that anyone who is born into slavery is a slave for a lifetime. And the reason that they do it is fascinating, because they also, what they had were slaves, former slaves who had converted to Christianity, and then once they declared themselves to be Christian, would seek representation in English courts that would say that they could not be slaves because they were now Christian members of the English nation. They were no longer, the way the laws had originally read in England were only infidel slaves could be slaves. But once you were a Christian, you were automatically freed. And Maryland, there were a couple of former slaves who had converted to Christianity who brought a lawsuit asking an English court that they be freed. And of course, the powers to be in Maryland, which was primarily an agrarian state, were sort of like, oh my gosh, we didn't see this coming. Interestingly, similar acts were passed in Virginia and in North Carolina and New York, South Carolina and New Jersey. Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were not interested in that sort of legislation. At that point, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were not as much dependent upon slave labor. Pennsylvania was predominantly Palatinate Dutch, Dutch Germans. Delaware, while agrarian, was small, and Georgia was still trying to figure itself out. Quite frankly, they were still a relatively new colony. By 1696, you have the first blanket statement by a religious group, by the Quakers, that they have a quarterly meeting that occurs in Pennsylvania, and they declare that the importation of slaves now is not only against the tenets of their faith, but it will be considered a sin. So, and anyone who violated it would be shunned from the Quaker church. So that was a pretty strong reaction towards slavery. You have, by 1705, Virginia enacts a piece of legislation that if you were a slave, it is lifetime servitude, as opposed to indentured servitude, which was more often used for non-African those who were in servitude of some sort. And so often indentured servants signed a document for their transport, and they served maybe 7 years. And doing research on my husband's family, I actually discovered one of his ancestors came over as an indentured servant. And the only reason I found out that was because he ran away after 5 years, and there was an announcement in the newspaper looking for Andrew Mitchell, who has departed for places unknown in the South. He had actually come to North Carolina, but he had run away. And there was a lovely description of him as being 6 foot tall, redheaded, blue-eyed, with a proliferation of freckles. Andrew was from Scotland. And it said anyone who found him to please send him back. So, that it was not uncommon for people to indenture themselves to be able to get free transport to the New World. We don't have a slave uprising in this country until 1739, and it occurred in South Carolina. Everything always starts in South Carolina. Those of you that have family from South Carolina, it's the hotbed. It is the hotbed of everything that happened. So first slave uprisings are there. And it occurred because there was a group of slaves in Charleston that sort of banded together, ran away from the farms and the plantations where they were, and they were headed to St. Augustine in Florida, where they were told they would be allowed to be free. St. Augustine was, of course, under Spanish control, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the Spanish were not particularly kind to those that they conquered. But somewhere they had gotten the idea that that would work. So there were a series of uprisings in South Carolina. 1780, Pennsylvania is the first state to totally abolish slavery. Now, why is all of that important? Well, because even by that point, by 1780, we are still in the midst of an American Revolution. You're beginning to see some division between how states, at that point, actually colonies, are interpreting what they believe is the appropriate relationship between those who have been purchased. Should slavery be allowed? Should it not? Is it moral? Is it not? Is it ethical? Is it not? And there's a debate, and there's not a really easy answer that we see in the documents. I mean, we may today say, well, that the answer to that would have been so easy, but the documents are really divided. We know that by 1787, and I think I mentioned this in a couple of classes ago, well, by 1783, which is the Peace of Paris, we become the United States as such. Massachusetts then declares slavery to be illegal, and slave trade will be outlawed in Maryland. Then the next year, slavery will be abolished in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And then in 1785, it's illegal in New York. And then 1786, it's illegal in New Jersey. So you can sort of see geographically where slavery is being declared illegal, but none of those are predominantly agrarian societies. So they did not have a preponderance of slaves anyway. 1787, we mentioned a couple of weeks ago with the Northwest Ordinance, which set out how the Northwest Territory could eventually apply for statehood, included in that piece of legislation the provision that there would be no slavery allowed in the Northwest Territory. And we talked about, those of you that were with me 2 or 3 weeks ago, whenever that was, trying to figure out how that piece of legislation got through the Articles of Confederation Congress. But it did. They were willing because that was a projected statehood. And, there were questions about whether the territories would ever have a large enough population to apply for statehood. It was sort of like, we'll think about that later, but we're just going to go ahead and say that there will be no slavery in those areas. You can't really talk about the countdown to the Civil War, talk about divisions between geographic areas, unless you go back to John Adams and his presidency and the Alien and Sedition Acts, which have nothing to do with slavery. They do have to do with immigrants coming in. And of course, Adams had pushed through Congress legislation that instead of the 5 years, which the Constitution said, once you were here 5 years, then you could apply for citizenship, he had pushed through legislation to make it 14 years. And it was an attempt, his fear, those fleeing from the French Revolution were going to come to the American colonies. We have this, brotherhood, fraternity relationship. And in Adams' mind, I do love John Adams, but bless his heart, he was a little paranoid at times. He was convinced that every immigrant coming from France was going to vote for Thomas Jefferson. And while he and Thomas Jefferson, as we will recall, had been best buds, they were not best buds by 1789. They were sort of hissing frogs at each other, swelling up and spitting at each other. And at that point, written anonymously, but we know it wasn't anonymously, Kentucky and Virginia enacted what were called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves. How many of you remember that from high school history? I didn't either. It was relatively insignificant, but it's fascinating because Madison writes the Virginia Resolves, Jefferson secretly writes the Kentucky Resolves, and what the Resolves said, oh my gosh, it's so dangerous, was that any state legislature could declare an act of Congress null and void if it did not agree with the beliefs and the ideas of that individual state. The idea of nullification, and that's where John C. Calhoun will get nullification, is from Jefferson and Madison, although it's written secretly, although everybody knew that it was Jefferson and Madison. And in the Kentucky Resolves, Jefferson actually alludes to the possibility of secession if the federal government, remember he's very suspicious of the federal government, if the federal government is so out of line with the state's government, the state, because it voted to join the Union, could in theory vote to secede from the Union. Now, he doesn't say it quite that simply, but it's out there in the Ethernet somewhere, and people are going, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could declare those laws we don't agree with to be null and void? Had I only known that with my first speeding ticket, if I had said, I understand the law says you cannot drive over 75. Anyone remember the days of 75 on the freeways? And I might have been doing 81. But if I could have said, but I need to be able to drive 80, so I declare your law to be null and void. Wouldn't that be lovely? You can see where the problem is going to occur. Well, so we're rocking along. 1803, Ohio becomes the 17th state. Kentucky was the 16th state. Slavery, Tennessee is the 16th state. Kentucky is the 15th state. Even though the Northwest Territory was said that there could be no slavery by the ordinance, Ohio comes in to the Union, and its constitution says, it reiterates that there will be no slavery in Ohio. So those of you that are in Ohio from the get-go, you all got together and decided what you were going to do. 1807, U.S. Congress declares that African slave trade will be prohibited after January of 1808. Now, remember, in the Constitution, there was this whole thing about slave trade, and they sort of say, we don't know what to do about this, so we're going to push that to the future, and a future Congress can decide that issue. Always a great way to do things. It's kind of like the national debt. We don't know how to pay for that. We'll just move it to the future. Well, we've been doing that forever. 1809, you begin to have, you have an ad placed in a New York newspaper for a runaway slave by the name of George Hicks. Now, they offered $25 to get George back. So $25 in the early 19th century, George must have been something special, but they want him back. And you have the first time ever that there are newspapers that refuse to run the ads. So that fourth estate becomes it's interesting, even though they were willing to, the slave owner was willing to pay for the ads, there were newspapers in New York that refused to run the ad. So that's kind of fascinating. So let's fast forward. And I know I'm talking really, really fast. Please raise your hand, whistle at me, yell, or whatever. Let's talk Missouri Compromise. Now, I know everybody remembers the Missouri Compromise from high school, 1820. It is yet once again, Congress's unwillingness to actually deal with the issues at hand. So you've got, a serious situation, 1819, 1820, the North and the South are really biting at each other. In Congress at that point, you have 11 free states, you have 11 slave states. That means there's equal representation in the Senate, which is the cooling off chamber. In the House of Representatives, though, even though population is varied, they know that any piece of legislation that's introduced into the House, that if it is detrimental to either side, it can get to the Senate, and there will be a good chance that there could be a knockdown, drag out, and it will die there. Well, the North at that point is increasing in population significantly. Think 1820s, Greek War for Independence. You've got a revolution occurring in Belgium. You've got a first wave of revolution in the German provinces that they'll revolt off and on again all the way until 1870 when they finally unite. So you've got lots of immigrants coming in, and most of them are coming into ports from at least the mid-Atlantic states northward. So northern states are gaining in population, which means that they are gaining significantly in representation in the House of Representatives. And with that as a backdrop, we have ready the state of Missouri, which applies for statehood, wants to be a state. And there is great trepidation in Congress because Missouri, because of its geographic location, and because it has pretty much been settled by farmers who have moved westward from Virginia across Kentucky, North Carolina, across Tennessee, it's going to come in as a slave state. Oh my, what happens? Because then we're going to have an imbalance. We will have 12 slave states. We will have 11 free states. There goes the Senate as that cooling off chamber. And so there is a decision to divide what had been the Massachusetts territory. And even though it had technically been divided, Maine historically had been part of Massachusetts. So they end up with a compromise. The Missouri Compromise basically says Maine will come in as a free state, Missouri will come in as a slave state. Slavery will be forever prohibited above the Louisiana Purchase Line, 3630. You all remember that? I mean, it's one of those things that, it's 5440 or fight, or 3630 for slavery. And they assume they've settled the issue of slavery forever. And they will admit states in such a way that there will always be a balance. Well, that would be lovely, but that's not how it's going to happen. And add to that some things that begin to create some concern, especially within the slave states. So 1822. There's a slave uprising that occurs in South Carolina, Denmark Vesey. And in the slave uprising, there's a plot to seize control of Charleston, but the word gets out, the militia, federal troops come in to put this slave uprising down. But when it's all over, there are 34 slaves that will be publicly executed for having plotted to overthrow the government of South Carolina. And what you find among the southern states is they begin to look at the numbers of their population and realize that in some states, there's almost an equal number of slaves as there are to white landlords. And what happens if the slave population begins to realize its own numbers? How do you stop another one of these sorts of slave uprisings from occurring? That's 1822. 1823, we begin to hear talk of Texas. That's when Moses Austin and Stephen Austin will leave Virginia and come across the southern states, gathering up families who are going to go to Tejas, to what will become Texas, because they have a land grant and they're going to settle Texas. And, you know, as people begin to think about the vastness of Texas, if you've ever questioned the vastness of Texas, just ask anyone from Texas. They will tell you. I tease my cousins in Texas all the time. It's sort of like, you know, there's Texas and then there's the other 49 states. They do remind me that they were once their own republic, and I remind them so was California. Whoopee. But anyway, I do love Texas. But, you know, Austin had permission to bring 300 families in. Part of what they agreed is that they would all become Roman Catholic and that they would be loyal to the government in Mexico. Well, that's not exactly how it turns out. And of course, he is only recruiting families that are coming from southern states. And many of those southern families do not necessarily have slaves. Most of them, in fact, didn't. Had they been wealthy enough to have slaves, they probably wouldn't have been packing up and heading to Texas in uncertainty. But they are farmers by nature. They are tillers of the soil. So there is, as the northern states begin to be aware of this migration toward Texas, they are very concerned that Texas, because of its vastness, if ever it were to become part of the United States, could possibly be 4 or 5 states. It could be like a Northwest Territory, and if so, then they would be slave states. So think about that for a while. The election of 1828 comes along. And in 1828, John C. Calhoun, I have to get my name straight, John C. Calhoun becomes upset because John Quincy Adams, who had been elected president in 1824 in the corrupt bargain, but Adams is president, signs into law a tariff. Now, it's a tariff that the South felt was terribly discriminatory toward them, because if you were importing anything from Europe, from England, from France, or whatever, the tariff was incredibly high. If you finished goods, if you were importing raw goods that could be used in a factory system, the tariff was basically non-existent. Well, the members of Congress, especially those in the Senate from the South, looked at that and said, well, that's totally unfair because the South doesn't have factories, so we're not going to be importing raw goods. We're importing finished goods. What it was an attempt to get the South to buy from the North, but the South saw it as a punishment for the fact that they were agrarian and non-industrialized, and John C. Calhoun gives it that tariff the wonderful name, the Tariff of Abominations, because that just really sounds good in speeches. And John C. Calhoun, let me tell you, go back sometime when you're bored and read some of his speeches. Had the man been an evangelical minister, he could not have been any more. You know, it's kind of like Jonathan Edwards with a political twist on the pulpit. I mean, the Tariff of Abomination and strangling the children of the South, going to bed hungry at night in their beds because their parents can't make, I mean, it was, the North was the devil incarnate. You could have seen the fire coming out of their mouth. So Calhoun becomes this spokesman for the South. Well, 1828, Andrew Jackson becomes president and John C. Calhoun becomes his vice president. It is not a good marriage. You know, every once in a while you have a president and a vice president who just, you know, as Adams and Jefferson had been, for those of us who are over 50, as John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were, I mean, they really didn't like each other. They really disliked each other. Well, Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun start off being okay, and then it quickly erodes into dislike, and then it becomes just, I don't want to look at your face. I don't like you at all. So by 1830, there's a series of things that begin to happen. The Webster-Haynes debate takes place on the floor in Congress, and you know, you've got a guy from Kentucky or from Connecticut that offers a resolution about the sale of land in the West. And then you've got Thomas Hart Benton, who says, well, you know, you can't sell the Western lands off to anybody else. That's the East trying to stop the prosperity of the West. And then you've got Robert Haynes from South Carolina, who jumps up on the floor and says, the decisions about expansion in the West need to be made by the people who settle there. It's the beginning of what will become Kansas, Nebraska. This idea that Congress really doesn't have the right to declare whether states, new territories are going to be slave or they're going to be free, although they've already done that in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. But apparently by 1830, no one remembered that, or at least not Robert Haynes of South Carolina. So there is this terrible, terrible fight on the floor in the House and in the Senate. And Haynes actually says, and I've got a quote over here: "The very life of our system is the independence of the state, and there is no evil more deprecating than the consolidation of a national government." You can just hear it. Well, Daniel Webster, who is quite a colorful character himself from Massachusetts, jumps back up and basically says that it is not uncommon for the senators from South Carolina to speak of the Union, and his words are in terms of indifference and even disparagement. And Webster declares that the Union of the states is stronger than the rights of the individual states themselves. And he says, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. And it becomes a huge thing because he has said now the union is stronger than the rights of individual states. So hence we get to this whole argument about states' rights. So 1830, Congress passes a bill which has nothing to do with slavery, but it's called the Maysville Road Bill. Yes, you don't remember it from high school because I don't remember it from college even until I spent a lot of time with Civil War. But they pass a bill to build a road called the Maysville Road. And Jackson vetoes it because the project was entirely in Kentucky. And he said it's not a road that crosses several states. It is not an interstate road. It is an intrastate road. And if Kentucky wants a road across Kentucky, God forbidden wilderness that it is, they can build their own road. But then he signs a piece of legislation funding the Cumberland Road because it involved more than one state. And there is this huge knockdown drag out that occurs in Congress. And Henry Clay declares himself forever and always to not like Andrew Jackson, which of course came as a surprise to no one because Henry Clay in the 1824 election had been the third runner-up. It had been Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and then Henry Clay had been the third presidential candidate. And in return for giving his electoral votes to John Quincy Adams had made him Secretary of State. So it's not like he and Jackson had ever really liked each other, or that Tennessee and Kentucky really during that period of history had liked each other. They didn't. Not sure why, but they didn't. They were both always fighting each other over land acquisition and expansion and those sorts of things. 1831, you have the first issue of the Liberator published, and that's William Lloyd Garrison, who is most famous for having said, "Go west, young man." But he also wrote an awful lot about abolition of slavery. So he was not a particularly popular person in the South. And it's sort of interesting when you look at it as to how newspapers begin to incite, the South will say, incite people against slavery, how those in the North will say inform people against slavery. And, the South will there will be a number of slave uprisings that occur in the early 1832s. Nat Turner's Rebellion is the most famous. And the South will blame the Northern verbiage, the Northern language, all of the talk of abolition as being a cause for those slave uprisings. A lot of research has been done, and the truth is that's probably not true because the majority of slaves, of course, couldn't read. They weren't aware. Now, did they overhear conversations about the possible abolition of slavery? perhaps, but we don't know that that truly was a cause. But we do know that there were those states that allowed free blacks to vote that after 1832 rewrote their constitutions, Tennessee being one of them, and disallowed even free blacks from being able to vote in public free elections. So it sort of had a negative. You have in 1832, again, an issue of tariffs. You have Jackson and Calhoun at odds with each other, and so much so that Calhoun will resign as vice president, return to South Carolina, run for the Senate, and will appear back in Washington as the senior senator from South Carolina in Jackson's face all the time. So that becomes an issue. 1836, I'm going to run quickly. 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. We'll talk about that in great detail a little bit later, but it's kind of like woohoo. Everybody remembers Davy Crockett, remember the Alamo, Goliad, San Jacinto, some of my favorite, stories coming out of the Texas War for Independence. But for our story, Texas plays into the countdown toward the Civil War because it is so vast and people are concerned. In fact, Texas, declares its independence in 1836, but it will not apply for statehood until 1845 because the message coming from Washington pretty clearly is, we don't know what to do with you. We don't know what to do with you because even if you come in as one state, you throw off the balance. If we divide you up, that's just going to, quadruple or quintuple the balance. So while we try to figure out how we're going to deal with all of this, could you all just sort of hang loose for a while, which is what Texas does. It becomes its own republic. And of course, Tennessee, Sam Houston becomes the president of the Republic of Texas. And they will truck along for 9 years, sort of waiting. The U.S. will use as their justification the reason they're not going to really talk seriously about Texas joining the Union because they are afraid that there will be a war with Mexico, and they are not really prepared to go to war. They don't want to have to deal with that. But the truth of the matter is that most of it was the uncertainty about what it would do to the balance of power. So by 1845, in March of 1845, James K. Polk from Tennessee becomes president. And Polk is the only president in the history of our nation who fulfilled every campaign promise that he made. And he only made 4 promises, one of which was Texas will be admitted to the Union. If you keep it simple, you can do it. It's, something for everybody doesn't seem to work out well. But he's going to settle Oregon. He is going to take care of Texas. He's going to deal basically with the California issue, and it will be on the road, and he will settle all of that. And that's exactly what he does. So Texas will come into the Union in 1845. Anti-slavery forces were opposed to it because they felt certain that Texas was going to be a slave state, which it will, but Texas comes in basically in June of 1845. Now, when that happens, where does that take us? Because now we're out of balance. Well, we have a number of things that go on. One, with the Texas War for Independence, once we admit Texas into the Union, there are a series of other events that will propel us into a war with Mexico. How many of you have an ancestor that fought in the Mexican War? Tennesseans should have a few because Tennessee was close enough that we sent several brigades to the Mexican War. The area around Nashville, Gallatin, Winchester, that central, middle Tennessee, both southern and northern, sent a number of troops off to the Mexican War. So the Mexican War, we're going to have to deal with. Now, why is that a problem? Well, when we're at war, but it is a war that will last only 2 years. But when the war is over, what the United States is faced with is a situation in which they have, because of the Mexican cession as a result of the U.S. victory with the war in Mexico. We have a whole chunk of land, and we have that land, which today would be New Mexico, Arizona, portions of Nevada, Colorado, California. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do with all of that land? Now, gratefully, at the same time, Polk has been involved in negotiations with Great Britain over the Oregon Territory, because there's a whole snafu going on up there where everybody is all upset. Where's the boundary line? The Adams-Otis line, which eventually will extend across and everything. But what are we going to do? So we are dealing not only with the Southwest Territory, but we're also dealing with the Oregon Territory that will come in, and that territory will be eventually divided up into a number of states. So basically what we have in 1848 is a compromise. Clayton Compromise comes into Congress, and it says there'll be no slavery in the Oregon Territory, and slavery in the new territories of California and New Mexico will be decided as they come in. And of course, that gets tabled. Compromise of 1850 is the next big major thing that occurs, because California is huge too. What are we going to do with California? And population, we go from it being a territory. Once gold is discovered in 1848, everybody remembers all the Disney movies with the 49ers and everything. Once gold is discovered in California, literally, they have 100,000 new inhabitants within a year. Think about that. That many people pack up, sell all their stuff, and decide they're going to California because they're going to be rich. These are obviously people who have had better luck than I have on winning the lottery or whatever, buying that ticket. Henry Clay, we're looking, and here's California, here's all the Southwest Territory, here's Oregon. Henry Clay, bless his heart, is known as the Great Compromiser. He never gets to be president. He is frustrated his entire life. He is a bitter old man, but he's the Great Compromiser because, just as he had with the Missouri Compromise, just as he's had several other times, he puts together the Compromise of 1850, trying to push forward the issue of slavery. So Compromise of 1850, California is going to be free. The rest of the Mexican session will be divided into territories, and those states will determine whether they will be slave or free based on popular sovereignty, which means once they have the 50,000 people that are necessary to apply for statehood, then those 50,000 people will vote and decide whether they will be slave or free. Clay thinks there's a good chance that Arizona and New Mexico will not come in as slave states, because his reports from the West is that it's a rather inhospitable landscape, and that it probably, when you think about the rich, deep, fertile soil of Kentucky, the bluegrass and everything, his reports from Arizona just didn't sound like anyone would possibly ever farm there. So he's thinking that's pretty good. Texas gets $10 million for a little strip of land that they're going to give to New Mexico, so that New Mexico has a little bit of fertile land. Slave trade is going to be abolished in Washington, D.C., and there will be a fugitive slave law. The South's not real happy about that, but they're willing to deal with it as such. What you have occurring next, let me get my right. So there's a lot of disagreement over the Compromise of 1850. The North is becoming more industrial. The South is becoming more tied to the slave agrarian system. And please do remember that it's less than 8% of the South owned slaves, but it was a part of the system because so many of those were huge tracts of land. We're in a situation now that by 1850, we have 16 free states, we have 15 slave states. So the South is outnumbered in the Senate as well as in the House, because in the House, the North has 144 seats, the South has only 90 seats. So New Mexico had indeed joined the Union as a free state. And so now everybody's looking at each other, trying to figure out how this division between the North and the South is going to play out. Into all of this, there is a book published. And it's interesting how a piece of popular literature can so intensify a national debate. But Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And probably all of you have heard the story of when Lincoln was introduced to her. He said, "So you're the little bitty woman who created the great big war." Because Stowe had never been to the South. She had never been farther south than Southern Ohio. But based on stories she had heard, she creates this piece of fictional literature, but it is an emotional tearjerker. Little Eva is carried to heaven by the angels and everything after being hunted down by the slave traders. And it just really increases the polarization between the North and the South. At the same time, you have the South really concerned about the fact they're outnumbered in Congress. So you have a proposal on the floor of the House called the Austin Manifesto, which basically is an attempt by the South to sort of push the idea of annexing Cuba as a Southern state. The plan falls through, but the South was going to allocate the money to purchase Cuba and had arranged a deal with Spain to buy it for $120 million. And they knew that it would be a good plantation style system because that's what was already there on the island. So that falls through. The South is frustrated, intensifying of emotions. Real quickly, Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854 basically said, you've got the remaining parts of the Louisiana Territory. They're going to be divided into Kansas, Nebraska, and we will base their admission into the Union on popular sovereignty, which of course leads to bleeding Kansas, because you have a lot of slave-holding people rushing to Kansas. You have a lot of free soilers rushing to Kansas, and they begin to attack each other. And it's from both sides. And I mean, it is, roving bands of guerrillas. That's where Cantrell's Raiders first make a name. And so, all across the nation, you have these reports of the free soilers killing the slaveholders and the slaveholders killing the free soilers. And again, the nation is polarized. The Republican Party is formed in 1854, and it originally was formed as a northern anti-slavery party, displeased that none of the current parties were really addressing the issue of slavery, that all of them were trying to skirt around it. So the Republican Party in its founding pledged, one, opposition to the extension of slavery and the repeal of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What they basically said was, when we allow popular sovereignty, what we are doing is we are instigating civil war between the parties that are going to rush to those states. Presidential election of 1856, the Republicans nominate John C. Fremont, former explorer, general, and all of that. And the Democrats nominate James Buchanan, and I will tell you that James Buchanan normally finishes very dead last on the presidential rankings, because Buchanan is a Southern sympathizer, but Buchanan really doesn't want to be president. And once he is elected, he declares, I didn't want to be president. I'm not going to run again. And I'm, really the power rests in Congress. And I'm just going to sort of sit here until Congress is done. Congress can decide these sorts of issues. So you have the Dred Scott decision, which you have Roger Taney out of Kentucky saying, even a free slave has no citizenship rights. You have the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, in which Abraham Lincoln's relatively unknown, but they're engaged in a debate about the issues of popular sovereignty, and Lincoln is not a supporter. John Brown leads his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, the raid to free slaves, to assault the arsenal, to grab guns, gunpowder, arm slaves for an insurrection. Insurrection is put down by a young lieutenant by the name of Robert E. Lee. And John Brown will be executed. He goes marching up to his hanging with, he has, his portrait is the Bible in one hand and his arm raised, against the heavens because of slavery in the other hand. Presidential election of 1860, a calamity. the Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln. He had lost in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas was elected to the Senate, but they sort of liked the way that Lincoln sounded and all that. So he's going to be nominated for president from the Republican Party. The Democratic Party splits three ways. The Democratic Party nominates, the constitutional wing of it nominates John Bell from Tennessee, most famous for the Bell Witch, for those of you that have ever heard that story. The what we call the free dollar Democratic Party nominates John Breckinridge, who is from Kentucky, and then the mainline Democratic Party nominates Stephen A. Douglas. Well, we all know what happens when you have multiple factions within the same party. The opposition party is going to win. Abraham Lincoln becomes president. And once he becomes president, Lincoln wins with only 40% of the vote, but he carries the North and he carries the West. And as a result, he wins in the Electoral College. So when we talk about, presidents winning popular vote, but not winning Electoral College, sometimes that happens, it's happened 8 times through our history. Well, the Southerners didn't like the way the election had gone out because they were very concerned about the way, what they believed that Lincoln was going to immediately, free the slaves, all sorts of things. South Carolina secedes, the election is in November of 1860. South Carolina secedes in December. You have February the 4th, the Confederate States of America. Remember, the president's not going to be inaugurated until March. Confederate states meet in Montgomery, the 7 deep southern states. They form the Confederate States in February. You've got Lincoln coming into office in March, and he comes into office, and the minute he comes into office, the 4 border states in March will join with the 7 states that had seceded earlier. The decision comes in April to resupply the federal troops that are at Fort Sumter on the island in the harbor of Charleston. Lincoln will always say that he was resupplying only with food and medical supplies. The South will allege that there were guns and munitions hidden in the hull of the boat, and the Southern forces will fire on the Northern supply ships, and we have hit the 1st of April of the American Civil War. And, I think probably as our time runs out, what the conclusion is that, sometimes we don't want to deal with difficult issues because there's not an easy answer. That's why they're difficult issues. But at some point, there is a day of reckoning. And for what had begun with almost the founding of the nation, and here we are 250 years later, it leads to a civil war that is devastating. It is still the most devastating war in our nation's history as far as the number of casualties, as far as the number who are permanently disabled because of the war. And even though we come out of the war with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, I think we are all honest enough to know that the shadows of the Civil War still, fall over so much of what we do today. And it's, if there's one thing I could probably do in this nation, it would be somehow figure out, as Lincoln alludes to in his second inaugural, a way to bind up the wounds and to help us come together as a nation. But the Civil War is still a dividing factor, and it was a long time in coming, and it was a painful duration of 4 years, but the legacy looks like it may last as long as it was in coming into conflict. So we're out of time. I promise we're going to get better at you all talking to me, but I mean, the stories are just so fascinating because you look at it and you see even people who are divided so politically, ideologically, wanting to figure out a solution, but no one is willing to compromise. It's the my way or no way on both sides. And if there's anything that probably I leave as a message today, it's the need for civil discourse, for being able to talk about differences. I I have lots of folks I love that we don't agree about everything. In fact, we may not agree about a lot of things, but I learn a lot when I listen to other people's ideas, and it gives me things to ponder between 2 and 4 when I can't sleep in the middle of the night. And we don't lose anything by listening to each other and thinking about ways that we can pull together, because I'm still convinced in this day and age that we are so much more alike than we are dissimilar, and that we all want the same things for the future. We want our children to have a better life than we've had. We want to think that there was a purpose for our existence, and that someone will care when we're gone, and that we have left some sort of a legacy. And what better legacy than making certain our children have a better life and live in a world that is more willing to talk with each other.